Hey, friend, in this episode of the Songwriter Theory Podcast, we're going to be talking about things like lyric parallelism, borrowed chords, and maybe where a good place to use a borrowed chord might be, especially if you're just getting into modes and borrowed chords. We're going to talk a little bit about alternate song structures, breaking outside of the really basic mold of just verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, and its minor derivations. And we're going to talk a little bit about what non-lazy songwriting looks like. And the song that this is all going to be off of is 100 Years by Five for Fighting. Let's talk about it. Hello, friend. Welcome to another episode of the Songwriter Theory Podcast. I am your host, as always, Joseph Vidala. Honored that you would take some time out of your busy day to talk songwriting with me. Honored that you are back for this second episode of the second season of the Songwriter Theory Podcast. This new look version of the podcast that hopefully is a benefit to you, because we're talking about a little bit of everything in every episode. We're going off of different examples, so we'll have a song for each episode that kind of is the jumping off point, really, to talk about things that we can learn from that song. Again, I said this last week, but in case you were not here for the last one, just know whether you like the song or not, whether you know the song or not, is irrelevant, because we will play the clips that really matter that we're going to talk about. And this isn't a Rick Beato, what makes this song great. That's not really the goal. Those are great videos. I love that Rick Beato does that. But the goal there is sort of music appreciation. The goal here is to learn about songwriting. We just happen to use songs as a jumping off point to talk about some of the things about songwriting that we can glean or learn from the song. If you've been a listener for a long time and you haven't left a review, that would help me out a ton if you could do that. Leave a kind review on wherever you listen to podcasts would help me out an absolute ton. I would appreciate that if you've gotten some serious value from any of these podcasts. And if you haven't already, be sure to grab my free lyric checklist. Goes through the 6 steps that breaks down lyric writing into an easier process that will get some better results. We're going to be talking about lyric writing first in today's episode, so figured it made sense to talk about that lyric writing checklist. Great way to make lyric writing less overwhelming and make it so that you are actually in control of your lyrics destiny, and you can repeatedly write lyrics that are actually pretty good, rather than feeling like you kind of get lucky when you just happen to have great lyrics. Having a good process is a great way to do that. All right, track 1. We're talking about the power of parallelism in your lyrics. I feel like this is not something we think about as much as we probably should as songwriters, especially when it is actually a tool that's used pretty often in songwriting. If you don't know what parallelism is, basically it's just when you have two things that correspond with one another and there's an obvious connection between the two. It's intentional. It's not just copying or being lazy. It's drawing a parallel between two things in an intentional way. Good example of this would be Star Wars, the prequels versus the original trilogy. So Luke and Anakin both have some similar things happen, right? They're both born on a desert planet, or they grow up on a desert planet in Tatooine. They both blow up a space station in like their first space mission on a ship. They both lose their hand in battle. They're both tempted by Palpatine, Darth Sidious. So those parallels are intentional, right? George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, is trying to draw your attention to these parallels, that they're going through some of the same things, because one of them ends up making a very different choice than the other. So that's parallelism, right? You're essentially connecting the dots between two things that may otherwise seem totally disconnected. And this is something that shows up in songs sometimes. This can show up in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes this will show up by actually having the last verse of the song be a repeat of the first verse of the song. Or you would have that sometimes after the final chorus of the song, there's actually a part of a verse that comes back that was said earlier in the song. That could maybe be seen as a sort of type of parallelism. At that point, you are actually copying word for word, which happens often. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's a form of parallelism. And then sometimes we just have a last verse that just really heavily connects to the first verse. And that's something that Fight for Fighting song 100 Years does very well, where the last verse has a clear allusion or parallel to the first verse that helps to make a central point of this song, really. So let's listen to the first verse and then listen to the last verse and see if we can catch the should be obvious parallelism. But this is the first verse.
I'm 15 for a moment, caught in between 10 and 20, and I'm just dreaming, counting the ways to where you are.
Okay, so that's the first verse. I'm 15 for a moment, caught in between 10 and 20, and I'm just dreaming, counting the ways to where you are. All right, so this is the first part of the first verse. 15 is the youngest age that's mentioned in the song 100 Years. The last verse now goes like this.
I'm 99 for a moment, I'm dying for just another moment, and I'm just dreaming, counting the ways to where you are.
Okay, so both the first part of the first verse and the very last verse that we get ends with the lines, and I'm just dreaming, counting the ways to where you are. And on the surface, you could just say, oh, he just like ran out of lyrics to say, there's not really anything to it. It's just like, all right, we'll sort of bookmark it or bookend it or whatever the term is, where, whatever we start with, we'll end with the same thing. But when you consider the theme of the song of 100 Years, which is essentially this idea that you only have 100 years to live, time is precious, live the moment while it's here because it's going to be gone soon. One of the great ironies is if you meet any 15-year-old, basically, every 15-year-old kind of wants to be an adult, right? They can't wait to get their license to get freedom. And you don't blame them, right? And I was the same way. We all probably were the same way. Couldn't wait to get our license to get some semblance of freedom. And we kind of look forward to being an adult, right? At 15, who do you think's really cool? Probably like college kids and people who like just started their career, people in their 20s, maybe early 30s, right? That's who you're like, ooh, I want to be that. So when you're 15, you're looking ahead. You actually want to skip ahead in time. But then when you're 99 or when you're just at the end of your life, you would give anything to go back to being 15 again, because now you realize at 15 you had all this time, and time is the most precious resource, the only non-renewable resource, right? You can always make more money. You can't always create more time. I guess you could just have better diet and exercise. That would help. But, whatever our time is, that's what it is. We can't, infinitely buy more. We can't live 300 years or anything like that. So that's one of the great sort of poetic ironies, right? That we're always wanting to be somewhere else. When we're young, we want to be older and taken seriously. When we're older, we'd kill to go back to being younger. And this choice to have those parallel lines draws our attention to that, right? The 15-year-old is just dreaming, counting the ways to where you are, right? Presumably somebody older. And then the person who's 99 is thinking the same thing, but they want to go backwards in time. I think it's Naval Ravikant, I think is his name, but he says something, I think this is him, it might be somebody else. But they said something like, the value of time to someone goes up infinitely at the end of their life, right? He says something like, if you have a $10 billion, at the end of your life, you would give up that $10 billion in a heartbeat just to get like another, I don't know, day to live, another year to live, certainly. You might give that just for another 20 seconds because just the value of time ends up going so high at the end of our lives. And essentially that's sort of what this parallelism gives us, right? This idea that time is what is so important. And at the end of your life, there's that irony that you're like, hey, I wish I could go back to the beginning or just when you're younger. And just to mention the chorus for a moment, just to kind of hone in on how this connects to the central theme, because usually the central theme is in the chorus. The chorus says, 15, there's still time for you, time to buy and time to lose. 15, there's never a wish better than this when you only got 100 years to live. So the idea that it's not that youth is better, right? But time is so valuable. And at 15, you have time. At 15, you're mostly potential energy, or you're all potential rather than, actual. By the time you're 99, you're pretty much all actual. All the decisions have already been made. And, you just have the life that you essentially signed up for. So parallelism is a great thing for us to include in our lyrics, especially if there is a point to it. Now, this is a great example of there being a very clear point to it. That's a real irony of life, that the people at their end of their lives love youth, and youth tend to want to be older. Now, youth don't want to be 75. They probably want to be 35 or 30 or 25 or something. But there still is that irony of whatever age you are, there seems to be this, oh, I wish I were younger, oh, I wish I was older, instead of understanding that time is finite and living in the moment and really appreciating the time as we have it. But this is something that can be utilized in any song, right? It doesn't even have to have this deep of a meaning necessarily. But a great tool to use is to think about how you can draw parallels from one part of the song to another part of the song. Maybe you have two different characters and you want to draw parallels between what's happening with one character and what's happening with the other. And just having something where, let's say you have different points of view in different verses. That wouldn't be a common thing to do necessarily, but it's not that uncommon either. But let's just say that's what we have. So if you just have one line that's essentially a refrain that is, the first verse, which is in one person's point of view, has its own lyrics. And then the second verse, which has another person's point of view, has totally different lyrics except for one line, right? That would be drawing a parallel between the two. And very often, again, you probably would do this first verse, last verse, to the point that many songs actually have the last verse literally repeat the first verse. It's pretty common to do something like you have verse, chorus, bridge, and then you have a miniature verse that's maybe 1-2 lines that are really just the first verse all over again, right? The first 2 lines of the song, you go back to it, and then boom, you get the chorus. And that's another way that we can sort of utilize this essentially parallelism in our lyrics. All right, track number 2. The perfect place to practice modes or borrowed chords. So a great way to level up our music writing can be to add things like modes to our writing and to add things like borrowed chords. Now, it's somewhat going to depend. I'm a big proponent of what I often call crawl, walk, run. Crawl, walk, run really is just about how we all learn to crawl before we learn to walk, and we all learn to walk before we learn to run, right? We learn to ride a bike with training wheels before we ride a bike that's on 2 wheels. We learn to swim with floaties on before we learn to swim without floaties on. In everything we do, basically, there's sort of this leveling up, right? There's a reason that we don't just skip to calculus. There are certain things that are foundational that we need to learn before we could possibly understand calculus. You can't just skip algebra and go straight to calculus, because calculus is built on top of algebra. You have to understand algebra in order to understand calculus. And music is something that is very similar, right? If you don't understand the basics of keys and how keys work, or basic chord progressions and chord progressions in the context of keys, which is what's really important, right? If you're someone that just thinks, oh, C major, G major, A minor, F major is a common chord progression, like that's true, but really that chord progression is a 1-5-6-4. What key it's in is kind of irrelevant, because that chord progression is the same as G major, D major, E minor, C major in the context of G major, right? So What I would say is, depending on where you are in your understanding of theory right now, borrowed chords might not be the next step, right? If you're somebody that doesn't even write your own chord progressions yet, you're using stock chord progressions, which is fine. That's a great place to start. Then the next step for you, and we had a whole episode about this, so if you want to know my version of how I would sort of learn music theory over time, right? What you start with these chords first, and then learn this next. But at a high level, it basically is, okay, fine, use stock chord progressions first, which means you're not really even writing your own chord progression. The next stage is then to understand chords in context of keys, but you're still sticking with just basic major and minor chords. So you got 6 chords that you're working with in every key. Let's take C major. You have 3 major chords, C major, F major, and G major. And then you have 3 minor chords in D minor, E minor, and A minor. You also have B diminished, but very often in major key songs, B diminished. Diminished chords aren't used as much. So you have 6, 7 chords that you're working with, right? Then the next step is, okay, maybe now we use inversions, because C in root position doesn't sound the same as C major in first inversion or C major in second inversion. This is going to be true for all chords. Inversion's super powerful way to level up your chord progressions without technically changing the chord. And then the next step after that, or a good next step after that, would be adding things like sus chords and add chords and seventh chords, things like that. And then at some point, you've kind of run out of diatonic things to do with your song. What's diatonic? Diatonic is when you are only using notes that are native to the key that you're in. So if you're in the key of G major, the notes of G major are G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. So all those things I just mentioned would be only utilizing those notes. They are diatonic to G major, because in the context of G major, whether you're using inversions of chords, you're still using the major and minor chords that are diatonic to the key, sus chords, seventh chords, all those things are going to be diatonic by default. So at this point, we still are writing totally diatonic music, probably. The great next step is to now move into not having everything be diatonic, which is what a borrowed chord would be. So if you don't know, a borrowed chord is basically just when you are taking a chord that is not native to the key you're in, but you're actually borrowing it from a different mode. So for instance, in G major, there is no F major chord because there's an F sharp in G major, as we covered. So there actually is an F sharp diminished chord, is what's diatonic or native to G major, would be that F sharp diminished. So if instead we were to borrow a chord from maybe the minor key, so G minor instead of G major, or a mode like G mixolydian, that is what a borrowed chord is, right? So for instance, if we have an F major chord in the context of G major doesn't have an F major chord because there is no F natural in G major. So in that context, we would say that's a borrowed chord because we are probably borrowing it from the G mixolydian mode. And we could have a whole discussion about how do we know it's from the mixolydian mode and all that. We're not going to get bogged down with that. That can be a separate episode, maybe, or we've sort of already talked about it with episodes that I had on modes before. But essentially, the mixolydian mode is just take major and flatten the seventh. So in the context of G major, we said we have G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. That's the seventh. So if we flatten the seventh, we have F natural now. And then the rest of an F major chord is not just F natural, but A and C, which are already diatonic to G major. So an F major chord in the context of what was G major, we would say that's probably a borrowed chord, borrowed from G mixolydian. And for the record, borrowed chords by definition also have to be from a parallel minor or parallel mode. What parallel means is basically whatever your tonic is stays the same. So G Lydian would be parallel to G major. G mixolydian would be parallel to G major. G minor would be parallel to G major. Not the same as relative. So if we say parallel minor, the parallel minor for G major would be G minor. The relative minor for G major would be E minor. The difference is relative minor means that it shares all the same notes. We're basically just changing the tonic. So E minor has the same notes as G major. All right. That got pretty theory intensive. Hopefully you're still with me. So, borrowed chords. That's what we're talking about. A little bit goes a long way with borrowed chords. So if you are someone that has already understood chord progressions in the context of keys, you're using sus chords like all the time, right? It's second nature to you to use different inversions. Sometimes you just are looking for, all right, I'm kind of sick of what I have. It's like when you first started, right? You do cookie cutter chord progressions that everybody's used a billion times, and then hopefully you get bored of them eventually, and you're like, I want to write my own chord progressions. This is boring. I'm sick of using 1 5 6 4 over and over again. Or, 6 4 5 1 or 2 5 1, all the ones that are just used over and over and over again. So at some point, you kind of get that way, presumably, about diatonic music. And just a good way to keep getting better at writing music is to add more concepts to your tool belt, to your music composition tool belt, essentially. And when you're ready to add maybe a little bit of modes and a little bit of borrowed chords, the temptation, I think, could be to go too far with it and to be like, I'm going to write a whole song in G Lydian, which is fine. I'm not saying you can't do that, or not even necessarily that you shouldn't do that. But what's usually more ideal is to sort of dabble first, right? You don't go, like the first time you take a few steps when you've only been crawling, you don't like go right into running, right? You kind of take an uneasy step and another uneasy step. We don't remember our first steps, right? But if you have kids, you know what I'm talking about, right? The first steps are not quite the same as the steps they're taking 6 months later. So opening maybe with a little bit of, all right, let's pick one borrowed chord that I want to have in this next song. I haven't ever used a borrowed chord, so in my next song, I want to have a borrowed chord. Great. A great thing to do is to just choose one place to have it in one song section. And the best song section to do that is going to be the bridge. Why is that? Because the bridge already, basically by definition, is the alternate section. When you think about the rest of your song, no matter what the song structure, let's say there's no choruses at all, it's just verses, and maybe has a refrain as the last line of the verse, say like The Times They Are A-Changin' by Bob Dylan. In that case, the whole song is verse, 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 verse. I think it's 5 verses. That's it, right? So what is the sort of iteration of the song? What? It's verses, right? Verse, verse, verse. That's the pattern. And then a lot of other songs would be something like verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, right? There's a pattern set. The standard is this alteration between verse and chorus. Then let's throw a bridge in there. Verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. Right, so we essentially have that same verse, chorus, and then the bridge is the alternate. That's different. And even when we have pre-choruses and post-choruses, it's kind of the same thing, right? Because pre-chorus is basically a prequel to the chorus in a way. It's setting up the chorus. And a post-chorus is essentially a chorus after party, or continuing the chorus, extending the chorus, if you will. So even in that case, let's say we have all the different main song sections, and let's say we have a post-chorus at the end of every chorus. It's pretty common to not have a post-chorus until after the second chorus, but we'll ignore that for now because it's not really that important. Verse, pre-chorus, chorus, post-chorus. Verse, pre-chorus, chorus, post-chorus. Bridge! And then maybe pre-chorus, chorus, post-chorus, or just chorus, post-chorus. So again, we have sort of the standard that's set that includes verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and post-chorus. And again, the bridge is the only section that's kind of out of left field, just out of nowhere. which is a part of why very often if you have a switch to the relative minor in a song, it's very often going to be in the bridge. Almost always, right? It's not usually common that, the chorus goes to the relative minor. Do some songs do that? Yeah, sure, of course. Very uncommon, though. Most of the time, you have all your risks and all your significant musical and lyrical change-ups in the bridge. So that's the best place to open with trying something like modes or borrowed chords. And the song 100 Years by Five for Fighting makes use of this. In the bridge, or first bridge, which is something we'll talk about later in the episode, but the first bridge actually utilizes a borrowed chord, and it's the only place in the song that it happens. Now, depending on how we analyze it theory-wise, we could maybe make the argument that the whole bridge actually goes into a parallel mode, or we could say that it just borrows the chord. We will get to that after we listen. Let's listen first.
To live, half time
C
goes
major,
by. Suddenly
D,
your eyes another
E
blink of an
minor,
eye. 67
F major,
gone, the sun
back to
is
C major,
getting hot. We're moving
then D. So this song is in G major. This is 100 Years by Five for Fighting. Very clearly in G major. The song throughout has F sharps in it. And then the bridge comes. We start with the major 4 chord, which is C major. And then we go to a D chord. I'm saying a D chord because we're going to revisit this, but depending on where you look, some people seem to think that it's a D major chord, which would be diatonic to G major. That would be what you would expect. It's a major 5 chord. Some say it's a D sus chord, which would make a difference in how we analyze it theory-wise, and we will sort of talk about the repercussions of either and how we can apply it to our songwriting in a little bit. And then we have E minor, which again is just diatonic. That's E minor is the minor 6 chord. And then we have that F major, which is not diatonic. Because as we mentioned before, in the context of G major, we talked about how F major is not what would be expected natively. We would expect F sharp diminished instead because there's an F sharp in G major. So F major would be a borrowed chord, presumably from the Mixolydian mode, because again, Mixolydian mode is major, but with a flat 7, which in this context, flat 7 would be taking F sharp and flattening it to an F natural, and we already have A and C in our G major key. So the whole chorus music, or the whole bridge music, is basically this: C major, which is major 4, and then 5, 6, and then a flat 7 chord that's borrowed, and then it goes back to C major, D major, and then back to the... So let's talk about the repercussions of whether this is D sus or G major. If it's D major, that means that we have D major, clearly D major, because we still have that F sharp in a chord, and then D major is another diatonic chord. And then this is the first time in the bridge that we actually have a flattened 7th. We actually have an F natural. And then back to C major, and then back to D major, so we have an F sharp again before going back into the verse. So if that's what the music actually is, that would be an example of a borrowed chord, because it basically is just for a moment we have F natural instead of F sharp, because even the rest of the bridge has an F sharp in it. If it's a D sus chord, which some versions of the sheet music have it as that, that would indicate that actually the whole bridge just went into the Mixolydian mode because we're actually avoiding the F sharp throughout the entire bridge, right? And this, sus chords are a very effective way to have a chord, and normally you're expecting that F sharp, right? You're expecting a major 5 chord, but we're not actually, making it minor, which it would be minor, D minor, if we utilize that that F natural already. But maybe we don't want that. We want to kind of keep it major sounding, G major, right? We can just choose to use a sus chord for our 5 chord, and then we're just avoiding even the conversation of, oh, is it F sharp or F natural? What mode are we in? What key are we in? We're kind of avoiding it. So you can just kind of assume, yeah, G major, G major, G major, why not? But really, we kind of just skirted around it because we could make clear we're still in G major if we have the F sharp. Or clear we are already in Mixolydian if we have the F natural. But we kind of just shirk the question for now to sort of set up the nice transition into that sort of unexpected F major chord. So, in your own songs, what can we take away from this? First of all, you can think about how the setup to utilizing your borrowed chord can kind of imply or decide even whether is it really a borrowed chord, just an isolated chord that's borrowed from a different parallel key or mode, or did you actually go into the parallel key or mode? Because if let's just say that the chord breakdown is with a D major, we're clearly still in G major at this point. No reason to think anything other. Oh, borrowed chord. First time we have an F natural. Back to C major, back to D major, reaffirming, hey, we didn't switch to C major. We don't normally have an F natural. It's still F sharp. We just had that one borrowed chord. And then back to the verse. That is a pretty clear, like, it's just a borrowed chord. But when you avoid it and you just avoid using the F at all until the first time we use the F in this bridge is actually when it's an F natural, that would imply the whole bridge shifted to Mixolydian. So C major, avoid F or F sharp, so we still haven't played an F or F sharp yet. E minor, there's no F in that. And then first time we have an F and it's a natural. That's unexpected. And then back to C major. And then again, there's the question of is that D sus or D major? But probably this one is D major because it would be smart to have that major 5 chord to go back to which is a G major, because 5-1, powerful transition. If you want to ever go to a mode or minor key or have some crazy change up and you want to quickly get back to, okay, but this song is in G major, or okay, this song is in this key really. Best way to do it, or easiest way to do it, go to the 5 chord, make sure it's a major 5 chord, and then go to the 1, right? Great way to be like, but seriously, we're in G major, is to have that 5-1. So, this song uses a flat 7 chord, borrowed from the Mixolydian mode. Maybe the whole bridge goes into the Mixolydian mode. And your songs, when you are considering borrowed chord or something like that, consider doing it in the bridge. A bridge is a really great place to do it. It makes most sense musically very often in the context of a song. It is a great way to go. It also is a song section that only comes up once. So you can have that, ooh, that's interesting moment of, oh, I didn't expect that there because I've heard F sharp this whole song and all of a sudden there's an F natural, which even if it's something that in context of the song, even if it's not overtly obvious, it usually is one of those subtle things that you're like, something's different about this section. It doesn't have to be super obvious, right? And with no context, you probably think, oh, it doesn't sound like anything. It just sounds like this whole thing was maybe in C major after all. But in context of the song where it clearly was G major the entire time, this sounds like a little bit more of a change up because it is. So you're writing a song, consider putting a borrowed chord in the bridge, consider basically just utilizing it once, or, repeat it in the bridge in the same spot if you sort of have one part that repeats over and over again. But consider just using one, right? This just has one borrowed chord in this song, one, and it is the flat 7 in the bridge. There's not like a major 2 somewhere else and a major 3 somewhere else and a flat major 6 somewhere else. No, there's one borrowed chord in the song, and one can go a long way in your song, just as it does in 100 Years. All right, track 3. Something powerful that we can do with our songs is to change up the song structure. And I think it's one of those things where a lot of people are slow to do it because they think, oh, it's going to stand out so much and everybody's going to notice and be like, ooh, that's weird. But honestly, you can change up song sections pretty significantly, and a lot of people won't even notice. Some maybe make it a little more obvious, right? Bohemian Rhapsody, I think, is one of the more obvious. Okay, there's no chorus in this song. It's really just like an A section, B section, C section, D section. I forget if there's 4 or 5 or 6. But that one pretty obviously breaks the mold. But you might be surprised how many songs you've listened to, and you never even notice that they kind of break the mold. And they don't really just do verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, or one of its many derivations, right? So a lot of times, the vast majority of song structures will be verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, with alterations like what I just said, plus pre-choruses, right? So now it's verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus. Or maybe you add a post-chorus. Most often, if you have a post-chorus, you usually also have a pre-chorus, but that's a made-up rule, right? It's not really even a rule. It just seems like that's the tendency. But hey, that's another way you could sort of subtly change up song structure. I'm sure I've heard a song that has a post-chorus without a pre-chorus, but I certainly can't think of one. It seems like the default is you have a pre-chorus first, and then if you still want more, you have a post-chorus. So a subtle way you could change up song structure might be just having a post-chorus without a pre-chorus. But adding a post-chorus is another just common alteration on really what is the same song structure. Still verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. It's just before every chorus, we add the pre-chorus, and after every chorus, or after almost every chorus, we add a post-chorus. And then there are other minor alterations, like adding a third verse after the bridge. So you have verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus. Something we talked about in last week's episode. Can be a powerful thing to do. Again, super subtle. And we can do things like start with the chorus, right? You can have a song that starts with the chorus. And probably like 98% of songs all fit into one of the things we just described. And there is no reason that needs to be the case. No reason that needs to be the case at all. There's so many more options than just those. So who says you need to have a chorus? That's a question that didn't even used to be asked before, because choruses really became sort of in vogue, I guess, probably somewhere in like the 50s, 60s. A lot of older songs don't have choruses. At best, they have refrains, right? A line or two maybe that repeats throughout the song, but not really a fully fledged separate song section that's a chorus. It existed before. I'm not pretending it was invented in the 50s, but probably most songs kind of didn't really have a true chorus, early 1900s and before. Or maybe it was at least 50-50. Certainly fewer songs did. Now it's just like accepted. Oh, every song has a chorus, but it doesn't have to. Who says we can't have two different choruses? Right? We just assume, once we have a chorus, that's repeats throughout the song. There's no second chorus. It's just, that's the chorus. Who says we can't have a finale? This is my favorite because this is an example of something where like I just noticed in a couple of songs and just thinking about storytelling in movies and stuff, and I sort of I don't want to use the word invented because that's I gave a name to a specific song section that is sort of based on other songs I've heard, but I essentially made up the shortened version to not take too much time on this. Is basically I realized, hey, the climax of the song musically is almost always the chorus. And the climax of the story is very often in the bridge, because the bridge is the alternate section, and the chorus usually contains more thematic stuff, and then the story is left to the verses and bridge. So very often the climax of the story is with the bridge. And I thought, well, you know what's awesome in movies and in stories? When you have a climactic finale at the end, and then boom, it's all over. And it just kind of leaves you wanting more, right? That's a great experience in a movie. That's a great experience at a concert. Almost every concert, whatever your favorite artist's biggest song is, they play it last, right? So that it ends on a high note and leaves you wanting more. That's a smart strategy. And very often instead we have like, oh, it's the third time we've heard the chorus. And don't get me wrong, the chorus shouldn't be boring after 3 or 4 listens. So the last chorus of your song shouldn't be a disappointment. But it is something we've already heard multiple times before. So it's not like that huge of a climax. Compared to, what if we had a song section that, like a bridge, only happens once, but like a chorus is actually the climax musically, and like a bridge, again, it is also the climax of the story. So we're making the climax of the entire song one thing that only happens once at the end of the song, and then it's over. So you think, oh, the chorus is the peak of the song, and I already heard the chorus a minute in, and that's as big as the song gets, that's as exciting, and then you actually one-up it at the end. Like, oh, the real big bad villain is this, and then there's this huge fight, and it's super exciting. That can be a great way to go. Hardly ever utilized, to the point that it's not even a real song section. Like, I came up with that term, and I came up with the factors that go into what I would consider a true finale. If you saw it labeled, it probably would be called outro, which is a ridiculous term for what this is, or a coda, which is, coda is really just anything that happens just at the end of music. A coda is really a music notation term more than it's anything else. So who says you can't have a finale or your own invented song section that breaks the stereotypes or the normal, oh, chorus is this and a bridge is this? And who says we can't have 2 bridges? Who says we can't have 2 bridges? For our songs, something that we should be thinking of is what's right for the musical journey of our song or the musical progression, and what's right for the story and lyrical journey. What's right for telling your story. That's sort of how I came up with the finale thing, right? I thought about, hey, what sometimes makes an awesome story is when it has the big climax at the end, and then it just is over. And then it kind of leaves you wanting more. Like that's a story strategy that I personally like a lot. And so I inserted it into songwriting. We can do the same thing with however you want to tell your story, whatever you feel like is the best way to tell your story in the context of a song, whether it's, doubling up on the verses, creating an alternate song section that borrows elements from the bridge and the pre-chorus and it kind of changes things up, or having a totally second chorus, essentially, where you have a totally different chorus every time. I don't know. There's so many different things that we can try, including things like having a second bridge, which is very often not even contemplated. Most people don't even consider the idea of having a second bridge. And I think a part of it, again, is the fear, oh, it's too different. That's crazy. 100 Years is a huge song. Probably most of you have heard 100 Years before this episode. This is probably not your first time hearing it, unless you're like, 12 years old. For most of you, you've heard this song. Very big song, and I think rightfully so. This, again, is not a music appreciation or anything like that we're trying to learn, so this isn't me trying to tell you how great these songs are. That's not really the point. But I do think 100 Years is one of the greatest. It's a fantastic song. I wonder how many people haven't even noticed there is essentially a second bridge in this song. There's essentially a second bridge in this song. This song has verse, chorus, bridge, verse, And then there's sort of an alternate ramp up chorus that's a little bit different than the other choruses, which, by the way, every chorus in this song is a little bit different, which we're going to talk about in the last track of this episode. And then there's sort of the second bridge right before going back into that final chorus. So let's listen again to the first bridge.
To live, half time goes by. Suddenly your eyes, another blink of an eye.
First bridge.
67 is gone. The
Clear
sun
break
is getting
from the
high.
chorus
We're
and the
moving on.
verses, right? It's going into the third verse there. And then the second, we're going to listen to the chorus into the bridge. So I mentioned it's verse, chorus, bridge, which is the bridge we just listened to, verse, which is the sort of final verse of the song. Then I'm 99 for a moment. And then we have sort of this alternate chorus that's sort of like a shortened chorus that instead of ending with when you only got 100 years to live, instead of ending with that, it sort of goes into this sort of second bridge or extended tag, however you want to see it. It essentially operates as a second bridge because it goes from a chorus back to a chorus. It only happens once. Basically, it's a bridge. It's a bridge. So opens with the chorus. That sort of alternate chorus. Melody's the same. Okay, we're getting to that second bridge now. It's the only time in the song we have this. It's the only time in the song we have it. It's not just a little tag. It's its own section, I think. You can maybe say, I don't know, it's a post-chorus that happens once and then back into the final chorus. So, we could discuss exactly how to analyze that. It maybe it's a post-chorus that only happens once, or it's just sort of an alternate section. It's not really even a bridge. I mean, a bridge is an alternate section. So that makes it essentially a second bridge. I wonder how many people know that song, like that song, and never have even realized it has a second bridge. But it works perfectly for the music, for setting up that sort of ramp-up chorus, right? Where we're sort of going through the 15, 22, 33, you're on your way, every day's a new day, ooh, second bridge section, and then the final chorus. So in your song, it's worth considering more alternate song structures, whether that's something like a finale that I've talked about off and on because I'm passionate about it. I think it's great. When I realized that essentially one of the things that inspired a finale, by the way, did you remember Don't Stop Believin', the song that everybody's heard a trillion times? Have you realized that the main part of the song that everybody knows, Don't Stop Believin', that only happens at the end of the song? Did you realize that? Because that's a pretty big song, right? And we only get the chorus, and it repeats at the end. But as far as song sections go, that chorus, or as I would maybe argue it actually is, a finale of Don't Stop Believin', hold on to that feeling, only happens at the end. You're like 3 minutes and 30 seconds into the song, maybe 3 minutes into the song, before we get to that section. And then it's that section, and then the song is done. So it essentially is acting as a quasi-finale, as I define it. Don't Stop Believin', right? So don't be afraid to change it up a little bit. Try some of these things. Make your own up. If Don't Stop Believin' can do it, and most people don't even notice, and that's a huge song. I mean, we've all heard that song a trillion times. And then 100 Years. It's not quite as, S-tier famous as Don't Stop Believin', right? Don't Stop Believin' is like if you met anybody who lives in the West and they said they hadn't heard Don't Stop Believin', you immediately I don't believe you, right? Like, of course you have. There's no way. 100 Years is like maybe somebody would be like, I don't know, maybe. And then you play it for them and yeah, I think I've heard that before. That's like the bare minimum you expect for 100 Years. But they're both extremely famous songs. and they have alternate song structures. They don't follow that same tried and true formula. There's no reason for you and I to not experiment as well, especially if it's right for the story we're trying to tell and if it's right for the musical journey we are trying to take our listeners on. All right, track 4. I want to talk a little bit about non-lazy songwriting. And that's because it seems to me that people want to do less and less work when it comes to songwriting. Really just things in general, right? Everybody wants things easier and easier. They don't want to have to learn anything. They don't want to have to do anything. They want it to be as easy as possible. And obviously, we don't want songwriting to be artificially hard, right? If I felt like I could write a great song in 1 hour every day, that would be great. But that's not realistic, right? Does it happen sometimes? Sure. But if you wrote all your songs in an hour a day, probably 99% of them are going to be average, would be a kind word. Probably. And there's just so many signs to me that people just want to do less and less when it comes to songwriting. There's, beyond the whole, people who, oh, I want to be a songwriter, but I don't even want to like kind of start learning an instrument. And you can write songs without knowing an instrument, but it's going to help if you know at least guitar or piano. Both would be ideal. If you know those and drums, and even better, right? But we're talking about even in the context of songwriting, where people are like, oh, I don't even want to write a bridge anymore, just verses and a chorus, which can be fine for a certain song, right? I'm not picking on that. I've done that. I've done songs that just have verses. Or one chord progression and loop it. Again, nothing wrong with that. Sometimes, right? But if all your songs are basically you come up with one chord progression, you loop it the whole time and just call it a day, I mean, we couldn't possibly make the composition of music any more simple and easy and frankly lazy, right? If we not only like we're using stock chord progressions, maybe, right? Chord progressions that have been used a million times. We're not even writing our own chord progressions. We're just using the ones that have been used the most, making no alterations to them. We're not using just anything to change it up, right? We're not using sus chords. We're not using inversions, nothing like that. And when we get to the point where everybody's trying to be like a loop songwriter, where everything is just like, oh, I write one short loop and that's the whole song. Then I just like have lyrics over it. Again, can be fine in moderation, but we shouldn't we don't want to be lazy songwriters where we try to make every song is just cutting corners as much as possible. Not to mention we don't want to learn or improve. And boy, I feel like the most hate I ever get is when I say things like, "Hey, maybe if you care about the craft of songwriting, you should care about, I don't know, learning and improving," which, yeah, includes, I don't know, maybe learning a little music theory once in a while, learning how to construct a lyric. And people get so mad at that. Like, I- what do you expect? Like, yes, just keep making boxes over and over again for carpentry or woodworking or whatever. And like, you just expect to become a great woodworker? Like, no, you're doing the same. Like, and isn't that going to get boring? But anyway, people don't like to hear this. So naturally, that's why we're going to talk about it. But that's really not why we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it because I think it's important, especially if we say we care about the craft of songwriting. We shouldn't be lazy songwriters. Again, this shows itself in so many different ways, but another way that the laziness in songwriting comes out is in crafting a song versus write everything fast. I don't know how many people are going to tell you, "Oh, just write a song in an hour or 15 minutes. Just write songs fast. Just pump them out." Right? And so many people will tell you like, "Oh, release a song every week." And that's just again a sign of it's lazy, right? Like really? You're only willing to I would never give more than an hour of my time to write a song. It's so ridiculous. Like that's like saying, "Oh, with my next woodworking project, no woodworking project would I ever spend more than 2 hours." well, have fun just making, I don't know, tiny miniature bookshelves over and over again, because like that's all you're going to have time to do. Don't be afraid to put in a little more work, even when people aren't going to notice. A phrase that I think I used in like the third episode of this podcast years ago was, don't be afraid to have your brilliance lost on people. What I mean by that is I feel like so many people have the attitude of, oh, people won't notice that my lyrics had a lot of time and thought put into them. People don't even pay attention to lyrics. Therefore, I'm going to be lazy and not put any time and effort into my lyrics. No. It shouldn't be about like, oh, whether a normie notices, right? Or whether some random person who listens to your music, like your mom or your significant other or your friend who knows nothing about music. That's is that really who we're writing for? Just results? Like I want to do as little work to get, I don't know, famous for my songs as possible, which by the way, like that probably isn't going to happen anyway. So you might as well not sell your soul on the way to still not being a famous songwriter. Not even to mention, famous songwriters basically don't exist. Famous singer songwriters do, but famous songwriters just basically don't. But something important, I think, is to really take seriously non-lazy songwriting. To not be afraid to have more music written, to have a little more attention to detail than your average song. So if you take one extreme, which is you write one loop it for a whole song, and you're like, there's my song, call it a day, which again, there's nothing wrong with. I've done it. I think it's a good experiment. I think if you haven't done it, you should do it at least once, right? I'm not saying it's a bad thing in and of itself. But if your average song is closer to that than not, maybe it's time to try pushing in a different direction. So the song 100 Years by Five for Fighting, which this episode again is centered around, if you have been here for the whole episode, is to me a great exercise in non-lazy songwriting, in an example that isn't where it isn't obvious that it's not lazy songwriting. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you listen to, a 10-minute prog rock song where it changes keys and tempos 50 times, and there's so many song sections, you feel like you just listened to a whole cantata. Uh, Obviously, that's not lazy songwriting, right? You could accuse it of maybe other things, but it's not lazy, right? They had so many different interesting musical things all in one song. The song's 10 minutes long. It has like 7 different sections or movements even, right? We're getting into like, this is more advanced than a lot of most classical music even. Nobody would accuse that of being lazy, and it's obviously not lazy. To almost a fault, I would say, where it's like, well, okay, but at some point, is writing a song just to show off how good at guitar you are? I think no, but that's a discussion for another day. So 100 Years is a good example of not overtly obvious, but not lazy songwriting, because it's something that most people probably don't notice, but there are different elements in the song that aren't lazy. One way is that the lyrics of the chorus change a lot, almost every time. The first chorus is 15, there's still time for you, time to buy and time to lose. 15, there's never a wish better than this when you've only got 100 years to live. The second time the chorus comes up, it's 15, there's still time for you, time to buy and time to lose yourself within a morning star. So it actually adds a whole bunch to the second line, which is interesting. I legitimately can't even think of another song that I have seen that before. And then 15, I'm all right with you, which is different. 15, there's never a wish better than this. This is also a little bit longer of a chorus, the second one. 15, there's never a wish better than this when you've only got 100 years to live. Then we have that sort of alternate chorus. 15, there's still time for you. 22, I feel her too. 33, you're on your way. Every day's a new day. Where essentially melodically it's just the first phrase over and over and over again. So it actually changes up even the phrase pattern. Which really there isn't that much of a phrase pattern, because the chorus changes slightly every single time. Has that recognizable when you've only got 100 years to live pretty much every time, except for this alternate chorus that goes right into this essentially second bridge. But and then the final chorus is 15, there's still time for you, time to buy and time to choose. Before it was lose and lose yourself within a morning star. Now it's choose. Minor alteration, but hey, 15, there's never a wish better than this when you've only got 100 years to live. So the last chorus and the first chorus are the two most similar ones. The second and third chorus have significant departures. That's not lazy songwriting, because he didn't just write a chorus and say, all right, I'm done, I wrote the chorus. Again, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but this is an example of not lazy songwriting. He put enough effort that even every chorus has some alterations to it. He didn't just write a chorus and called it a day. Another thing is, one of my favorite parts of the song, actually, is the tag at the end of the first chorus, which only happens once. Only happens once. It's like 10 seconds, and we'll play it in a second. But how often do songs have a tag that happens once and only once and then just moves on? Most of the time, what you would expect to happen, in most songs, whatever the riff for the verse is, would just come back right after the chorus, right? The chorus ends and then just back to the riff that underlies the verse. And then the second iteration of is when you would start singing. That's what you expect, right? That's what's normal. But instead, we get this.
When you only got 100 years to live.
That's not the verse part, right? And now it goes back into the verse. Only happens once. It doesn't happen ever again in the rest of the song. This, again, is not lazy songwriting. He didn't think, oh, that part's kind of cool, I need to shove it everywhere to make it worth it. He didn't just not even consider, like, oh, well, after the chorus, you just go back into the verse riff. That's it. No, he came up with this. Right? Only happens once. And he came up with that just to have a nicer transition, more interesting transition back into the second verse. And again, it's one of my favorite parts of the song, like non-lyrically, just from a musical standpoint. I don't know. There's just something about it that really resonates with me. And a lot of songwriters never would have written that. Just never would have written that. And again, our goal here is not music appreciation. I'm not telling you, oh, this is a great song, you should appreciate it. The point is, as songwriters, I'm a big proponent of trying things across the spectrum. A lot of people, I think, intentionally mishear me in order to straw man what I'm saying, because they just want to be mad that basically I'm saying, hey, don't be lazy, when they are being lazy, because nobody does like to be told that, even if it's good for them. I think we all need to be told that sometimes. But there's nothing wrong with going as simple as possible with music. For instance, as an experiment, I once wrote a song where I'm like, I wonder if I can just loop these two chords and still write an interesting song, right? And essentially how I made the song interesting was layers, because that one simple chord progression over and over again, it's just two chords. It was really easy to add multiple vocal parts that could all stack together, and you could kind of build the song over time slowly, which is what I did, right? So doing things like that as an experiment to get better as a writer and stuff, I think is great. And can make great songs. So I'm not saying every song needs to have no, I'm not saying that. In fact, if you're somebody who never has tried just writing a single loop or having one chord progression for the whole song, I would encourage you to do it. It's a great exercise. It helps force you to make a song interesting via other things, right? Like growing over time, or make the arrangement more interesting to compensate for the fact that the chord progression is interesting. There's many different things that it can teach you. It can be super effective. You can do certain things that maybe you can't do in other songs. But we shouldn't just concentrate on that end of the spectrum. And that's where I think a lot of people go wrong. They think simple all the time. Oh, simple is good. No, it's not. If simple was good, we would just say good instead of simple, right? Simple isn't good. Complex isn't good. Good can be complex, sometimes it's simple, sometimes it's sophisticated, sometimes it's basic. What's right for the song is usually what's good, which is a whole other discussion. But I would challenge you, push yourself further towards not lazy songwriting. We all have that temptation towards lazy songwriting, right? That doesn't make any of us special. We all probably have it to a degree. I think many people give into it too much. So don't just press in the, simplify direction. Also push in the, you know what? I'm going to write a 10-second riff tag for a song that only happens once that most people are never going to notice, but I think it adds to the song. Or I'm going to have slight alterations to the lyrics in the chorus that make sense as I'm developing the story. Or you can go farther than what Firefighting does in this song. There are many songs, right, where the choruses completely change lyrics because the chorus is actually a part of telling the story. So that can be done as well. That's, again, an example of not lazy songwriting. And this can be taken to an extreme. For example, one of the longest it ever took me to write a song, that's not English, but it's a song called Flightless. And the reason it took so long is it has something like 3 times more lyrics than most songs have. So if you think of your average song, it's something like verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. And usually the choruses all have the same lyrics. So that's 4 different song sections worth of lyrics you had to write for that song. This song, each chorus had different lyrics as well as every verse. And it had 2 bridges and a finale. So if we add up the lyrics for this song by song section, we have verse 1, chorus 1, verse 2, chorus 2, bridge 1, bridge 2, verse 3, finale. That's 8. That's double, right? It's still a 4-minute song, right? And most people probably won't notice, won't care, but it's not about them, right? It was the best way to tell the story, and it also was partially an experiment as well. But, 4-minute song at the end of the day, and I had to write something like 2 to 3 times as many lyrics as most songs to still have a 4-minute song. So I would encourage you, have a little bit of that, right? Have a little bit of the firefighting attitude of, you know what? I'm not afraid to have a little bit of my brilliance lost on people. I'm not afraid to do something that people won't notice, won't appreciate. I'm not afraid to put a little extra work and crafting into a song and not just think of everything through the lens of, but will anybody notice? Will it help make the song more popular? Will it help me go viral on YouTube? Don't think through those lens. As an artist, we shouldn't be thinking through that lens. Are we a business first or are we an artist first? I'm very pro-business. I think business is great. But when it comes to art, man, you got to think of the art first. So my challenge to you, in the next week, figure out a way to move as far away from being a lazy songwriter as possible. Maybe your songwriting challenge for the week can be, instead of simplify, think about, hey, what's something that would make songwriting more challenging or just add more to my song, like a tag that happens once or alternate chorus lyrics or a second bridge or whatever that will move me in the opposite direction, where I'm actually getting a little more sophisticated in how I'm writing a song. All right, track 5. I'd like to answer questions from the mailbag. This is a question from a longtime listener and somebody who has been really comments a lot and emails me a lot and is very supportive and great. So I appreciate you, PJ. But this is from PJ. I heard an interview with Lionel Richie regarding the topic of song titles. He attempts to include the title in the song's first line and preferably the first word of the first line. He wants the title embedded in the listener's mind to make recall easy. It makes sense when you think about it. A couple of other benefits come to mind for this method. The title gives an insight into the song's story and invites the listener in, and it may call the writer to begin the song with a chorus, which is the core story. So, few things on this. First of all, thank you, PJ, for the email. I always like when people send sort of thought provoking emails, and this is one of them. So I think there's always two ways to look at this. There's practical, which if you were to be cynical, maybe you could say business, and artistic, right? On the practical level, an obvious song title early on likely is going to help with song recognition, right? So people will listen to your song and they'll remember it so that when they go home and they don't know where they heard it. Maybe they heard it on the radio. Maybe they heard it because, your good friend is a good enough friend that they put your music in a playlist and their friend's like, wow, that song's really good. They didn't realize that it's just somebody that your friend knew. And the song title was obvious. So they go home, they look it up on YouTube Music or Spotify or whatever they use, and they can find your music. Right. So from a practical / business, success in quotes, business success or, popularity success standpoint, totally makes sense. Right. And I think that's not something we should just dismiss outright. Of course, that's a factor in songs. And then there's the artistic side, right? Which is what's right for the song. What's the central identity of the song? What most helps the song artistically? These are the things that we need to consider. And connecting it to, the idea of the first line. I don't think it's a net good or bad to have the first line contain the title. I certainly know many songs that do have that. I think it can be effective. It is great, as PJ points out, that it's sort of setting the stage or getting right into the story right away, right? It gives you the main, maybe even thesis of the song right away. And something else he mentions is that, this also could be a way to sort of get you to start with the chorus, which is, he says the core story. I would maybe argue that chorus is usually the core theme, not the core story, which is different. But sometimes the chorus is more story driven. Sometimes it's not. More often than not, I feel like it's more theme than it is story. But it certainly is the core of a song, right? So to open with a chorus, I think also can be a very effective tool. But something I always like to think about when it comes to song titles is we always like to use obvious song titles. We all, I think, default to that. But sometimes a song title can actually be a really effective tool for a song, for adding context to a song that might not actually be in the song itself. We're often so busy thinking about, can we, should the song title come from the first line of the song or the last line of the chorus or the first line of the chorus? Or is there a line in the bridge that most encapsulates what this song is about? Or do I have this line that I just think is really cool at the end of my last verse that's like, actually, I kind of want to name this song that because it's a more interesting song title. We consider all those type of things. And I think not often enough do we consider, how about a song title that gives context outside the song that isn't just ripping a word or a line from the song? One of the best examples of this I can think of is Good Riddance, in parentheses, Time of Your Life by Green Day. Now, this song is widely misunderstood as a nice song until you look at the title, because it kind of sounds like it would be a nice song. And once you realize the title is Good Riddance, in retrospect, it's kind of like, oh, yeah, I see how this is kind of like just laden with sarcasm, right? It's just, the whole song is just sarcastic. Oh, I hope you have the time of your life. It's a giant screw you, basically. And having the song title Good Riddance adds the context to know, hey, this whole song is sarcastic, that you wouldn't have otherwise. And it would be forced to insert it into the song. The whole song is just dedicated to this sarcasm, this bitter sarcasm of, presumably you left me in a horrible way. You suck. I hope you have the time of your life. And by that, I mean, I hope that everything goes awful for you from here on out. to brute force in the song, like some sort of, hey, listener, this whole thing is sarcastic. So I'm going to have a line that talks about good riddance out of nowhere, or, have the song kind of get outside of the sarcasm for a moment just to like make sure people understand, hey, this is sarcastic. No, the song doesn't do that. The song commits to the sarcasm, and the title is what gives the context. I don't think enough songs do that. It's a powerful tool. Another example, to stick with Five for Fighting, as we've talked about in this episode, Superman. In parentheses, it's not easy. You notice a theme here that very often in parentheses, you have a part that's more identifiable. But the song Superman by Five for Fighting never once mentions Superman. Now, you'd have to be a moron, I feel like, to not know the song is about Superman. I mean, there's imagery throughout and lines throughout that's like super obvious allusions to Superman, right? I'm just a man in a red sheet is a line. There's talk of, I'm more than a bird, I'm more than a plane, I'm more than a pretty face besides a train, right? Look, a bird, a plane, it's Superman, right? There's so many allusions that I don't know how you would know. But the song title is what sort of brings it all together, that like this song is a song from Superman's perspective. So it's just Superman. And then the song, he doesn't have this weird line out of nowhere that's like, I am Superman, and then continues, because like people don't talk like that, right? Like I mean, we have I'm Batman, I guess, but like normally that's not how it would go, right? It would be awkward if in the song he's like, I'm Superman, by the way. And really this connects to I think an important artistic theme. Mostly I think it's important because lately, especially with most movies now, which are almost all unbelievably bad. I mean, MCU and Star Wars are beyond embarrassing at this point. And I know there's more movies than that, but like everybody kind of, it started as like a large group of us were like, everything sucks, guys. Our standards are so low. Now, basically everybody agrees, right? Like only shills seemingly are left that are like, no, it's good because shiny, pretty things. Like it can't even construct a basic story anymore. Anyway, I think it's important in art to not treat your consumer, the person on the other end of the art, like they're stupid. A, because it's condescending, and stop it. B, because it almost always ruins art, right? That's why we have movies now that will like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, basically at the camera. They'll basically break the fourth wall just to be like, hey, did you get that? Did you get that virtue signal? Or did you get that, very overt thing? Like, there's no subtext anymore. Subtext is such a powerful thing. Don't treat people like they're dumb. People aren't dumb. People can figure it out. And that doesn't mean everybody is going to figure it out, but don't worry about that. Don't let your brilliance be lost on people. It's okay that some people who listen to the Green Day song Good Riddance don't realize it's sarcasm, right? People don't realize tons of crazy stuff. So when it comes to song titles, well, I agree with PJ that it's an interesting thing to think about. It's worth considering, hey, maybe we should open with the chorus, have the song title be from the first line of the chorus, and have that be the first line of the song. The recognizability of it is worth mentioning. I would maybe argue that it still makes a song more recognizable to its title if it's in a chorus that repeats than if it were in the first line of the first verse, which happens only once. So it's kind of blink and you miss it. But if the first line is the chorus, then you're kind of getting the best of all worlds. I think those are all great things to consider, to think of. But I just figured it was worth mentioning as well, this sort of opposite end of the spectrum. A song title that actually is adding to the song artistically rather than just being a book cover. It's adding something that isn't within the song itself, which can be a powerful tool when naming your song. All right, friend, thank you for listening to this episode or watching this episode. Hopefully it was helpful to you. Again, something else you'll likely find helpful is my free 6-step lyric writing checklist. Really helps to break down lyric writing into smaller steps that are just more easily completable, that will help make lyric writing less overwhelming. It's at songwritertheory.com/lyric lyric checklist. And if you're somebody who has enjoyed this podcast in the past, enjoyed this episode in general, want to help this podcast out, great way to help out is simply to leave a kind review wherever you listen to podcasts. That is honestly one of the best ways you can help out, is just to take 2 minutes, 1 minute to leave. If you feel that this podcast deserves it, a 5-star review. If you feel it doesn't deserve a 5-star review, you should shoot me an email, joseph@songwritertheory.com, and let me know how to improve rather than tanking the rating, if you don't mind. But if you're wondering how to help out, really the best thing you can do is leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. You don't have to put any text. You can, it certainly is helpful if you do. But it doesn't have to take any longer than, I don't know, the 1 minute it takes to click the 5 stars and call it a day. Again, just if you found this helpful, I appreciate you. Best way, if you appreciate this podcast, you can show it, is leaving a review. Regardless whether you leave a review or not, thank you for listening. Thank you for being somebody who's a listener. Thank you for just being somebody who gives a rip about songwriting enough to listen to a podcast about songwriting. There's only so much time for podcasts. You could be listening to Joe Rogan. You could be listening to Jordan Peterson. I don't know. You could be listening to whoever else you listen to that's maybe more, I don't want to say enjoyable, but less practical, we'll say. And instead, you're listening to this, talking about songwriting, which means the craft of songwriting is important to you. Obviously, it's important to me. I'm making the podcast. And just the fact that people care about songwriting still is something that means a lot to me, because I care about the craft of songwriting as well. Anyway, have a great week. I will talk to you in the next one.